But there's a place where there was major events. We got another book plug. I mentioned earlier Uncontrolled Chaos by Vance Nevada. And Vance has been a wrestler, writer about wrestler, gadabout, as our old friend Dennis Chestnut down in Barberville, Kentucky used to say, around wrestling for 30 years. And he has come out with this book that he just sent me a copy of, and I'm pretty sure it's out. I know it's out, as a matter of fact. I have the information. I got an advance copy. But the website is uncontrolledchaosbook.com. Now, you can get it through Amazon, et cetera, but obviously, we want to go straight to the author for our people, a more personal touch, and he gets to keep more of the money. Uncontrolledchaosbook.com. It's Uncontrolled Chaos by Vance Nevada, but what it is an encyclopedia, almost 500 pages, on the history of wrestling in Canada. And he goes province by province, and, for example, Ontario and Quebec and et cetera, and it gives the history of each promotion since the early 1900s that has run the area, pictures, clippings, posters, bills, et cetera, from those eras, and talks about the top talent and the happenings, whatever. And obviously, it goes first the territory system through 89, and then he actually updates with more of the newer major independents. I'm pretty sure that there's probably been some outlaw mud shows up there that have run under the radar, but all the major independents that ran after the territories went away. And then there's a variety of lists in the back of champions and of top wrestlers and gates and crowds and different things. And so anyway, I haven't got it all the way through it yet because it's monstrous. It's huge even. But one of the lists in the back caught my eye, and it's, I don't know how many, but it's like the top, 50 or so crowds in Canadian history. And, here's the thing about this information. If I said to you, what is traditionally, historically, consistently over the last 100 years, the biggest city for wrestling in the United States, you'd say Chicago. That's pretty much a given, right?
Say that again. For the last 50 years?
For the last 100 years.
Last 100 years?
But really all of professional wrestling. In the United States, the most consistent city, the biggest city, no major lulls or problems or issues would be Chicago.
Well,
I
mean, they had an amazing run, and the whole business was really based out of Chicago for a while, but for the same years, when you look at when Chicago kind of went down, although WWF did good in Chicago, New York did have a lull a couple times.
Yeah, a big one for 10 years, 12 years. That's what I'm saying. Gotch and Hackenschmidt, for fuck's sake. Starting in the early 1900s, Chicago drew, 2 million something equivalent in today's money for Gotch and Hackenschmidt. It was huge in the 30s. They ran the business in the 50s, the International Amphitheater in the 60s and 70s. The WWF, that was one of their main markets. Chicago is the city in the United States.
And of course, Paul Alperstein in the 90s. Can't forget that.
Well, there you go.
No,
the only negative $50,000 gate in wrestling history.
With the caveat that the Cubs suck and the Mets are the best, I agree with you about Chicago.
Okay, but if I opened that up and I said, what's number 2? And instead of the United States, let's make it North America.
Toronto.
There you go. Toronto is obviously the number 2 city in North America for pro wrestling, and with its history, I mean, in the 40s when New York, Madison Square Garden was dark, Toronto and St. Louis were Wild Bill Longson's best cities, drawing 10,000 people a show. Nanjo Singh, who was the top heel in Toronto in the 30s and 40s was the inspiration for the ramp they used to have, and did until the end of the territory days, where guys would walk through ringside on an elevated 4-foot ramp because people would try to get that fucking Nanjo Singh. And then Longson used to hide under the ring. It became a thing for the top heel to hide under the ring in Toronto in Maple Leaf Gardens, and they got that ramp to try to get them above the people. But Toronto has been incredible for wrestling. So on this list of the top 20 crowds in the history of Canada, and there's only 2 cities involved, Montreal and Toronto, and they're actually pretty heavily toward Montreal on the top 20, although Toronto has the top several spots. Harley's having an allergy attack. Take a drink of water, baby.
Clearly, she roots for Montreal.
But anyway, I thought we would go through the list of the top 20 crowds in the history of Canada because, you know, we've talked about how, oh, goddamn, people just say wrestling's bigger and better than ever. And boy, howdy, the big wrestling resurgence. Out of the top 20 crowds in the history of the country of Canada to attend professional wrestling, do you know how many are from the 2000 and teens?
How many of the largest crowds in the history of Canadian wrestling are from the 2000s?
How many of the top 20? How many are from the 2000 and teens?
I'm just going to throw a wild guess out there. 2.
None. Do you know how many are from the 2000s?
2.
1.
That was close.
Do you know how many are from the 1990s?
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting because this is kind of the end of it, and I don't remember crowd sizes, but Jacques Rougeau had some big shows. You were a part of one show, but I don't remember the crowd on that show. I'm going to guess... Plus, the 90s, that counts WrestleMania 6. I'm going to go with 4.
5.
Okay.
Do you know how many from the 80s?
Well, the 80s has the biggest one ever, which is 86. Hogan and Orndorff. Maple Leaf Gardens was running regularly, so it wouldn't have been any extraordinary crowd there. Montreal had some big shows. That was the end of Montreal as a big town. From the 80s, I'm going to go with 3.
4 of the top 20 crowds in history. The 1970s.
Unless I'm wrong, I'm going to guess any crowds in the 70s that would have been record crowds would have come from Montreal. I'm going to go with 4.
2.
Fuck.
The 1960s.
I'm not sure because I don't know if they ran any stadium shows ever anywhere. Well, they would have. Well, trying to also add up how many have we done so far? 2, 4, 8. 1.
2.
Yeah.
Okay, and we're going to do the last one here, and then we'll get into them. But to recap of the top 20 all-time biggest crowds in Canada, 1 was from the 2000s. None was from the 2000 teens. 1 was from the 2000s. 5 were from the 90s. 4 were from the 80s. 2 were from the 70s. 2 were from the 60s. How many from the 1950s?
I was supposed to add these up and I didn't. How many?
6.
Wow.
More of the top 20 crowds in Canada from the 1950s than any other decade. Now, this will skew a little bit because, as you mentioned, because of a couple of WrestleManias. But let's go in ascending order. Number 20. August 24, 1996, Toronto. I was there. That was the exhibition stadium, right? It was just a house show, not a pay-per-view. But because Toronto was always good and always so hot, they'd either run the Sky Dome or they went outside. It was summertime. Main event, ladder match, Shawn Michaels and Goldust, 21,211 people.
You know, I have to admit, I'm a little surprised by that. I don't remember hearing too much about that. I mean, I'm sure I did at the time, but it's not one of those shows that you still hear people talk about when Shawn Michaels drew 20,000+ in Toronto.
No, well, it was a house show. That's all it was. But Toronto was hot even before everything else was hot. Toronto stayed hot a lot. But it was, I wrestled Jose Lothario on that show. It was the weekend after SummerSlam with Michaels and Vader. And I remember I told you a story when I took the bump off the apron after Michaels nailed me. When I went to the floor, I over-rotated and the point of my left knee went straight into the ground. And I either popped a bursal sac or swelled it up or what. It was swollen up with a lot of fluid and a lot of blood in it. And I had that match. I knew we were going to draw 20,000 people. And the payoff was going to be decent. So we did TV on Monday and Tuesday. And then I had a couple of days off. I had driven because SummerSlam was in Cleveland. And the TVs were around there. And then I just took a couple of days off, sat in a hotel room, iced my knee, and went to the stadium show. Didn't show anybody or let them see me take my pants off because my whole leg was purple. So they wouldn't let me work. And me and Jose did like 3 or 4 minutes. And I got $3,000 Canadian, which was $2,200 or whatever in real money at that time, and would probably be, about $4,000 or more now. Anyway, but that was number 20. Number 19, August 15th, 1956 in Montreal for Eddie Quinn. Edward Carpentier and Killer Kowalski.
I was going to say it has to be Kowalski.
And that was a stadium show because they drew 21,454.
Wait, that was 56?
1956.
When did Carpentier really take off as a draw? Because 57 is when they give him the NWA title, and then they dispute it, but he ends up being a world champion going forward. When did he really establish himself as the draw?
In Montreal? Well, hold on. I didn't know you were going to ask me a question, or I would have had this marked, but I'm sure that this book will tell us, but I'm going to say 54, 55. He jumped in and was hot quick. I'm trying to get to the table of contents so that I can find Quebec. Aha, Quebec.
That's where I'd go right now if I had to go to Canada. I'd be in Montreal having a good time.
Here we go, Eddie Quinn. And Eddie Quinn promoted from 1939 to 1963. Hold on. A lot of details. Kowalski's reputation was cemented during an October 15, 1952 showdown against Yukon Eric. That's where he knocked Eric's ear off with his knee drop. And we're getting to, By 1956, Quinn's territory was reportedly grossing $1.3 million per year. It was in 1956 and the Montreal territory.
Canadian dollars.
Canadian dollars, whatever that may have been. So we don't even know how to really figure that. But in Montreal, the action would often feature 2 or 3 outdoor cards each summer, commonly at Delormer. It's probably French, so I'm mangling it. Delormer Stadium. That it could accommodate bigger crowds than even the sold-out Montreal Forum. And Carpentier, I think 55, 56-ish is where I'm seeing all the big business. That was Carpentier. And then in 57, Eddie Quinn renounces the NWA and withdraws. So he got this guy that was hot and drawing all this money, and they tried to take him away, and he got pissed. And that all happened within a couple of years.
57 is also the riot in the Garden. He's in the middle of that.
It says Carpentier attracted the eyes of the industry when he headlined 3 events, drawing more than 20,000 fans in the summer of 1956.
That's how you get over with the other promoters.
That's exact. So number 19 was Carpentier and Kowalski.
That's like JYD. Who's this guy all of a sudden selling out the not selling out, but who's this guy all of a sudden getting all these people into the Superdome? All of a sudden Carpentier pops up. In one summer, he draws 3 crowds.
Well, and more to come. Number 18. And this was August 26, 1985, Gino Brito in Montreal. the promoter, drew 21,500 for Bravo and Tonga against Volkov and the Iron Sheik. That's when Vince was still allowing some talent to do something in a market like Montreal that one of his guys was figured in, because Bravo had been involved in the promotion there for years.
Well, he wanted Montreal. He wanted all of Canada. Yeah. You got to remember, Vince's plan was all of Canada, and he needed one promoter. And when he got Jack Tunney, that's when it was okay to screw over Stu Hart on that deal. But he was originally just going to have Stu as his guy. He didn't know that the Tunneys were going to, or the Tunneys, that Jack Tunney in the Toronto office was going to become available. But he wanted Stampede, he wanted Montreal, and he wanted Toronto, and he got it all.
He got it all, just like Bogey and McCall. Okay, where were we at? 2019, 18, 17, number 17, August 18, 1954. Montreal for Eddie Quinn,
Yvonne Robert.
Yvonne Robert, and Pat O'Connor.
Wow, and Pat O'Connor, wow.
Not even for the NWA title. It was too early for O'Connor.
6 years earlier, yeah.
But Eddie Quinn, Montreal was hot at that point. 21,616 people. Wow. And then you go to number 16, also in Montreal, July 17, 1957, for Eddie Quinn, Killer Kowalski and Gene Kiniski, 21,851. And that, if I'm not mistaken, would have been for the Montreal version of the world title at that time, would it not?
More than likely it would have. It really is one of those things that a lot of people don't realize, just what a big star Gene Kiniski was before he got the NWA belt. But everywhere he went, he was a main player. He was used as a top guy. He had, from all accounts that we have, good matches with everyone. And look at this crowd that he's drawing here. And this is over a decade before he's the NWA champion.
Yeah, well, he got the NWA title based on the reputation he had made in the mid to late 50s, working for Vern, drawing huge money, then working as a world champion for, I think, Bruiser, the WWA, right? He held that. He held the, what was the offshoot Omaha title? He held that.
Yeah, the AWA. Omaha had their own AWA title.
So, he had already been a big star for like 10 years. And then I've lost count now. These aren't numbered. I'm doing them backwards by myself. 2019, 18, 17, 16. Number 15, August 18, 1986. The WWE gets on the board here in Montreal. Hulk Hogan versus Don Morocco drew 23,000 even.
Where?
In Montreal.
In Montreal. What's the date on that in 86?
August 18, 1986.
Is the Rougeau match on the list versus the Garvins?
This just lists the main events. No. So
I didn't remember what the crowd was for that.
Wait a minute. Hold on. They may be Rougeaus and Garvins. Hold on. They're down, because then everything is close together between 17 and 20,000 in the bottom of this list.
Because I thought that was 86, and I was just curious how that crowd size would have been versus that WWF one you just said, because that was the last hot program they had as an independent promotion outside of WWF.
You know what? I don't see. Did they do more than 17,700?
I guess not. That's interesting.
I'm not seeing it. I'm seeing Johnny Rougeau, the original, and Abdullah the Butcher in Montreal in 69 is on the list.
In 69, so when did Abdullah become a main eventer in Stampede? It would have been after that, because it was after Archie Gooley left, yeah.
This was February 17, 1969. Rougeau and Abdullah drew 18,761 in Montreal. But nevertheless, now you've derailed me. I've lost track of where I was. Okay, Hogan and Morocco. Basically, that was a big WWE house show. It wasn't a major pay-per-view or big advertised event. It was just, again, business was hot. And then we go to July 18, 1956 for Eddie Quinn in Montreal. Edward Carpentier and Argentina Rocca did 23,227.
Wow. That's a heck of a main event when you think about who they were. Athletically, the style they wrestled at the time and everything. That's an interesting match.
That would be what is it? Is that the modern day like Ricochet versus Rey Mysterio or what? Only these guys were full grown. But it had to be green as a pepper tree. Carpentier's brand new. He's only been in the business like what, a couple of years. From the time he started. Rocco we've seen the footage, unorthodox to say the least, and the attraction was the flexibility and the leaping and everything, but goddamn, he had to be a pain to work with. So I bet that one was, and also two of the great egos in all of wrestling history.
Do you think working with Rocco was like working with Mil Mascaras in terms of what you could actually do as his opponent?
I've watched a lot of Mascaras in 70s and 80s stuff, and he was a lot easier to work with. Not easier to beat, but he was a lot easier to work with than Rocco was.
He didn't just throw his feet at your face all of a sudden.
Yeah, it just all of a sudden you don't have the guy's big toe up your fucking nostril. All righty then, moving up in the world. On January 31, 1997, in Toronto, the WWE drew 25,628 for Bret Hart versus Shawn Michaels versus Sid Vicious.
Where? In Toronto?
In Toronto.
No, but what building does it say?
It does not have the building, but I would assume that was the Sky Dome.
I guess that's one of those things that you don't think about a lot as a fan here in America. They were running actually just house shows at the Sky Dome?
I remember several house shows at the Sky Dome. Again, and this was before the quote-unquote really attitude era got started and kicked in. Again, it was just, you knew if you went to Toronto, you were going to have a big house. And whether it was when I first started, he was still working with Jack Tunney. And then I think Tunney became more of a figurehead, and Carl DeMarco was really promoting, or behind the scenes promoting all the events in Canada by that point. But no, Toronto was always good. But then, wait a minute, where are we at? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We are at number 7. And that would be, and I lost my finger place. July 21st, 1960, the 7th biggest crowd in the history of Canada.
1960, interesting. Buddy Rogers?
Nope. Killer Kowalski versus Lou Thez in Montreal for Eddie Quinn, 25,703 people.
Wow, now that's 1960. Thez was an NWA champion at that time.
No, I believe, again, it was probably Kowalski.
Yeah.
Defending whatever the Montreal title was at that point.
Wow, I did not expect that match. That's a surprise to me.
And again, no wonder Eddie Quinn and Lou Thez were always so close.
Yeah. If you ever want to know why Lou Thez had nice things to say about certain people in his book, just go look at the results.
Okay, and now let's do a little math here. Now, let's say Thez and Eddie Quinn were close, we know, and Thez was not the NWA champion, so the 10% would not have kicked in. And Kowalski at the time was the big draw in Montreal, and Thez was a legend coming in to face him. So let's assume...
you don't think he got his 10%? I don't want to go past that. He was still Lou Thez. It was 1960. He was just off that run as the international champion.
Yes.
After he was the NWA champion, they decided we still want you as champion. So they just gave him a new belt.
Okay, McMahon, but Ed McMahon there, not Vince. I don't want people to think that. You're ruining my bit. What I'm saying is, even though they were friends, he was friends with the promoter. And even though Kowalski was a big draw too, even if Thez didn't get his 10%, let's say that he only got his 5%, right? 25,000 people. And even in those days, tickets in Montreal to a stadium, and let's do American money because it's kind of sort of, if they were $3, $4 tickets, right? You've got a $100,000 gate there. And one would assume that Thez and Kowalski would have both been remunerated for that very well, but if Thez got his 5%, there's goddamn $5,000. What is $5,000 in today's money 60 years later? We just talked about it in Indiana. It's about 10 times. That means he went up there and picked up in the neighborhood, give or take, adjusted for Canadian money, whatever, $50,000 in today's money. Oh gosh, if it was only 25 or 30. That's what I'm screaming, as Tracy Smothers would say.
How many guys, let's say from 1960 on, were able to demand a percentage even if they weren't champion? Fez, The Sheik, Bruno. Who else, if anyone? In the States.
Lawler. Lawler had 10% of Memphis before he became a full partner in the promotion. I mean, here's the thing. That's why a lot of those guys were able to sell Georgia, the Briscoes. And that was an old deal that the promoters would do when they needed a top talent that was integral to their business. They would say, here, I'll give you 3 points, or I'll give you 4 points in the office, or whatever. So that way, not only did they get their wrestling pay, but if the territory made money, they got a piece of that somehow. That's how, the Briscoes got into Atlanta, because when the war happened, Barnett came in, and to straighten shit out and make sure they had steady access to the guys from Florida and the world champion, a number of guys got a few points in the office. So it would depend. Probably some people that we never knew, because they were just instrumental to the, did Leroy McGurk ever say, hey, Hodge, I'll give you 2 points in fucking Oak City or whatever? We don't know. I mean, Ron Wright had a piece of the promotion in East Tennessee under the table for a while before he ran it himself, and then blah, blah, blah. But, I mean, big stars who would just command a percentage of the gate to show up. In the modern era, Rogers could do it. Gorgeous George did it at one point. Like we mentioned, the NWA champion, Fez, even when he wasn't the champion, the Sheik in some cases, Bruno to come back and work for Vince Sr. But that was a heavy deal. And that was, well, okay, let's go up one notch from Kowalski and Thez to 1, 2, 3, 4, number 6, July 17, 1972 in Montreal.
During the war.
Would you like to take a swing at who that main event was?
1972 Montreal. Again, this is during the promotional war. Before I answer that, can you just tell me this? Are there any other 1972 Montreal matches above this on the list?
No. There is a 1973.
Oh, I'm going to get this wrong. Andre versus Donnelly O'Jonathan.
You are incorrect.
What is it?
That was at the Montreal Forum. This was the, if I'm not mistaken, the Jerry Park show in Montreal. The Sheik versus Jacques Rougeau. Jacques Rougeau Sr.
Senior. Yeah.
I will make sure. Well, he was the only one at the time. This was 50 years ago. Sheik and Jacques Rougeau were on the Rougeau side of the promotion, battling the Vachons and the other guys at Grand Prix. And the Sheik was working for them, and that was 26,237 people. And knowing the Sheik, again, it's a $100,000 house. It's Canadian money, but he's the king of Toronto. He's running fucking Detroit. Is he going to come up there for less than $5,000 and do a stadium show in the main event? He wasn't hurting for money at that point. He was that was at the time Detroit was grossing more than almost any promotion in the country because they were on that hot streak, and he was ruling Toronto. And by the way, down later on this list, down lower, because Toronto Maple Leaf Gardens could only seat 18,000 people, right? So in 1971 and 1972 and 1973, the Sheik has 7 matches in a row listed at just 18,000. Sheik and Tiger Jeet Singh, Sheik and Carlos Rocha, Sheik and Pampiro Firpo, Sheik and Andre the Giant. He literally sold out or came close to, as we've talked about, that 7-year win streak in Toronto, where he was selling 30,000 tickets a month in fucking Toronto. Anyway.
There may be no one in wrestling history who drove more people into the gates and eventually drove them out of the gates.
And eventually drove them back out. So, That was the Sheik and Jacques Rougeau on July 17, 1972. Would you care to take a guess? What happened at the number 5 biggest crowd in Canadian history on July 14, 1973 in Montreal?
73 in Montreal. Is it Killer Kowalski?
It certainly is.
Killer Kowalski versus Andre the Giant.
You are incorrect. Maurice Mad Dog Vachon.
Shit, that's right. Fuck.
Kowalski and Vachon, because Sheik and Rougeau had set the record in Montreal the July before, so the Grand Prix promotion came back the next summer and beat it. 29,127 people for Mad Dog Vachon and Killer Kowalski, July 14, 1973. That was the biggest crowd drawn in the early 70s promotional war. And shortly thereafter, obviously the book has been written. Bertrand Hebert and
Pat LaPrade.
And Pat LaPrade, thank you. I've slept since then. Wrote the book, but the two sides, through various situations, ended up mending fences and coming together, and it killed the fucking town. But nevertheless, so the next 4, the top 4 gates, as you would suspect, are all the modern day WWE, and we'll talk about those too. But is that incredible that the WWE has owned Canada since the late 80s, and all the big shows that they've presented there, and the 1950s are the decade where there were more big crowds in Canada than in any other decade in the history of their wrestling. And we must bear in mind that now that we get into the WrestleManias and the big shows, these shows that we are talking about were promoted to the city of Toronto or Montreal. There wasn't national television across Canada or across the United States. There wasn't a worldwide television promotion making its annual big event, there in the town. It was people in and around the cities of Toronto and Montreal that made up those crowds. And in the 50s, this was before, any type of, in the 50s and the 60s, really before any type of, modern communications or whatever. So this was just good old-fashioned local promotion. And the guys being over in the markets.
Memphis, same thing too, right? Record crowds, because they didn't run any giant buildings all those years. The record crowds were from the 50s or from 59.
Well, yeah, because they had to go outdoors because they couldn't get that many people in the Ellis Auditorium, and the Mid-South Coliseum didn't exist yet. So they went for Sputnik Monroe and Billy Wicks. They went to a ballpark. But otherwise, because it was a weekly territory, they never did big shows because they wanted people to think every week is a big show. So, but again, all of the territory days, these crowds were drawn. People talk about the New Orleans Superdome. And when WWE fills it up now, there's only 10,000 people from fucking New Orleans or even from Louisiana. All the rest of them are from everywhere. But in those days, you could see, if you were an hour and a half or 2 hour drive from any of these towns, you could see a local show in your town without having to go to New Orleans or Toronto or whatever.
And you didn't have to spend your entire salary to take your family.
No.
And you can come back the next week and still not spend your entire salary.
Yeah, because the tickets were $5 and you were only driving 20 miles across town.
What do you think wrestling would have been like? I mean, it's a different world and it's a different economy now. But like when you hear things like AEW, and this isn't to put down AEW, but just using an example, they didn't get as many people in Queens, but they had their record gate. What do you think wrestling would have been like back then if there were higher ticket prices? Well, it wouldn't have, as I'm saying this, it wouldn't have worked. Because if
it wouldn't have worked.
You would have priced out your audience.
Yes, you would have priced out the mainstream audience. This was not, it wasn't a hobby. For being a wrestling fan wasn't a hobby back then. It wasn't except for a few of us. Where I would collect the magazines and the books, and some of it would collect the magazines and the books and the pictures. A lot of times the girls collected my pictures of all of the baby faces, and that was their hobby. But it was just something you did, like you went to football or you went to bingo or you went to wrestling or whatever. They weren't studying the ins and outs that weren't even known at the time of the promotions and the people involved. There was no place to look up and get all these secrets and all this information. You watched an hour of TV every week and you went to the matches on Tuesday night. And that's what you did. And millions of people did that. And if you had tried to jack them around, because these were working class and blue collar people, and not everybody, as we've seen, we have doctors and lawyers and whatever, or people who grew up to be doctors and lawyers, but you couldn't price it out. There was no high-priced merchandise or collectibles. There was no trips across the country to see a major show because you had no idea when a major show was going to happen. You'd read about it in the magazines 3 months after it took place in Los Angeles or whatever. These were all people of every race, creed, color, national origin coming out live and buying tickets to watch the wrestling matches in their town every week or every month. All right, let's get to the top 4. And they're all Toronto. Because once the WWE took over and Toronto is fascinated with them, February 8th, 1999, Steve Austin versus Mankind drew 41,432 people.
Now, what was that show? It wasn't just a house show, was it?
I'm thinking that was an In Your House, was it not? February 8, 1999. I think, I don't know, you can Google it if you want to. And then the one you spoke about, and now let's talk about these attendance figures. August 28, 1986, Hulk Hogan versus Paul Orndorff, 61,470. That was the house show, and again, was that Exhibition Stadium? Or was it a different stadium that they had back then?
It was Exhibition Stadium, I believe, but it was also part of, was it Canada Day? I mean, it was a big event.
It was the Canadian National Exposition or something or other like that. But I remember I talked to Ed Cohen about that. They had gotten the opportunity to run in conjunction with this big, exhibition or exposition or function that was going on at the time in Toronto. And it was going to be treated like a regular house show. But at the same time, obviously, Toronto's a big market, so they gave him Hulk Hogan and Paul Orndorff. That was the hot house show thing they were going with at that time, and Hogan and Orndorff always had great matches. And they ended up shitting themselves when it did 60,000 people. Because they had not expected that. They expected it to do good, but it was over and above anything that they had really done at the time, right? When was the second best? At that point in time, in 1986, what had been the second biggest WWF crowd to that point in history?
Shea Stadium.
There you go. And that was 38,000 some?
Maybe a little
36,
less than that.
What was it? 30. So yeah, Shea Stadium with Bruno and Pedro Bruno and Hansen. Bruno and Zbyszko and Hansen and Andre. Bruno and Pedro was 72.
And it didn't draw because of the rain.
Yeah.
And the other thing about this Toronto show, it was this event that led WWF and led Vince McMahon to decide on the Silverdome for WrestleMania 3 because they saw this crowd in Toronto and knew some of these people would come over the border for that event.
Yeah, it was easier to cross the border back then. But yes. So the next biggest house or next biggest crowd that they had drawn up to that point in time was in 1980 with Bruno and Zbyszko at Shea Stadium. And Andre and Hogan, I should say. I was thinking of Bruno and Hansen in 76 with goddamn Inoki, so I'm all fucked up. But yes, Bruno and Zbyszko, 1980, Andre and Hogan was underneath, and that was 36,000 or thereabouts or whatever. This was 25 5,000 more people than they had ever drawn before for a house show. So, yeah, they shit themselves.
How about the fact that in 1 week, I think it was the same week. If it wasn't the same week, it was the same month. I think it was the same week. Hogan and Andre were on the Superdome with JYD and Michael Hayes, and they were on Shea Stadium with Zbyszko and Bruno.
Yes, it was that same week. So they were in 2 shows, they were in front of fucking 60,000 people live. And number two on the list of all-time crowds, Toronto, April 1st, 1990, WrestleMania, Hulk Hogan, The Ultimate Warrior, 67,678. And that's what I was going to ask you, because I'm not trying to impugn Vance's integrity. But is that the legitimate crowd, or is that what they announced?
I thought it was a little lower than that. I thought it was in the 60s, but I don't want to say that's wrong because I don't know for sure, but I would have to go check. I thought it was a little less than that, though.
And the good thing about the territory stuff is either you could tell because the seating capacity of an arena was pretty much cut and dried, or the newspapers covered everything fairly legitimately. But with the WWE, one excuse they gave was they count everybody in the building, including the employees and the wrestlers and the ticket people and the fucking concessionaires and anyway, Hogan and Warrior was number 2, and number 1, you're not gonna. Oh my God, when I saw this, March 17, 2002, it was obviously WrestleMania. 68,237 people in Toronto. Triple H versus Chris Jericho.
Well, that wasn't the main event. I mean, that was Hogan and The Rock.
Well, and also when you get to WrestleMania, yes, you're a piece of the puzzle, but as we've seen lately, that thing's going to draw on its own these days.
And those were the years where Triple H may have been in the main event spot, but he wasn't seen as the main event guy. Again, you had Hogan and The Rock, you had Steve Austin on that show. No one saw Jericho and Triple H as the main event.
But by the power of the pencil. But there you have it. But I thought that's fascinating. 6 of the top 20 crowds in Canadian history in the 1950s, thanks to Eddie Quinn. And again, the aughts and the teens have not been good to big shows in Canada. But boy, the Sheik sold some tickets. And I mean, there's some other lists in this book, like, wrestlers having headlined an event, drawing 10,000 people or more. The Sheik is in the number 1 place by far with 94 events that he worked on in Canada, drawing 10,000 or more. And to those events, 1,120,187 tickets sold.
Who's number 2?
Yvonne Robert.
What kind of drop from 1 to 2?
94 to 62.
Wow.
When the Sheik owned Toronto all that time, and that was one of the biggest indoor buildings in Canada, Whipper Billy Watson actually has 65 number of events headline drawing 10,000 or more, but was 15,000 less on the ticket total. Hulk Hogan has 39, Killer Kowalski 48, Carpentier 37 events drawing over 10. And this is, by the way, obviously with regular events being more numerous than the big shows that drew over 10,000, we're talking millions and millions of tickets. Steve Austin at 24, Yukon Eric 28, Don Leo Jonathan 24, Andre the Giant 22, Buddy Rogers 20, Luthez 20.
Could they have taken better advantage of Bret Hart's fame before everything went south, obviously? Because obviously he's not really on this list.
As a matter of fact, he drew 11 crowds of over 10,000 in Canada because he was on top at a period where they had cooled off, and right as they were starting to get hot again, and Canada was first, as we've illustrated, that's when he and Vince got on the outs. He took the year off to do TV and let Michaels twist in the wind, and then came back, and Canada's getting hot, and then he's gone. So he's in that Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Sid match, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, number 8, January of 1997. And by the time they came, so yeah, he would have been much bigger.
Who do you think is the biggest star in Canadian wrestling history? Whipper Billy Watson or Yvonne Robert?
Oh, I got to think. I'm going to say this. I'm going to make the French people mad. Watson translated better to American wrestling also because, he looked like a normal English fellow, right? Bill Potts. Whereas Yvonne Robert, French was his native language. He was primarily Montreal-centric, whereas Watson, I think his profile was larger across the whole country. And then Watson became a name in the United States, which made him a bigger name in Canada. And then, flirted with the NWA title. So I think it has to be Whipper Billy Watson, right? And maybe he had more longevity also, did he not?
I believe so. I have Swami barking in the background, so. Okay.
Anyway, Uncontrolled Chaos. Canada's remarkable professional wrestling legacy. Thank you, Vance, Nevada. I'll tell you, if it wasn't for historians like this, Brian, we would be in the dark. We wouldn't know what the fuck was going on. And that's why now it's so important. We've got to salvage this history now that the newspapers are online. Now that all this information, all this research is online, you can just tap into it with the touch of a fingertip on the keyboard, but you don't know what you're getting into these days when you get on the internet, right? It's a dark and disturbing place.
Well, it can be, of course, unless you protect yourself.
Well, you got to be protected. You don't raw dog a hooker behind a dumpster in an alley off of Broadway.
No.
Without being protected.
And you don't go to that in the spot 20 seconds into the spot.
I wasn't even in the spot.
Raw dog a hooker? What? Jesus.
Well, especially if she happens to be from Brazil, Colombia.
What?
Points south like that. You want to be protected. You want to be covered up. And, here's something else. I mentioned this the other day on your program. You don't want to take a shit without closing the door. You're exposing all of your private dangly bits to perusal and examination by others. And that's the same thing. You're exposing your dangly bits with that hooker in the alleyway over the dumpster off of Main Street. You don't want to expose your privates. Just lay them out there. Just have them out laying in the sun, ready for everybody to come and step on or kick or puncture or mistreat in whatever way. You don't want to do that, do you, Brian? You wouldn't lay down on Broadway naked with your legs spread out and your balls hanging over a manhole cover and just let people walk up and kick you in them, would you?
Well, not since I was in my 20s, no, but apparently that is a big thing. A lot of people like to tan their testicles now. I don't know why, but...
Well, but even if you tan in your backyard where you could let the polo ponies roam free, not in the middle of the street where people can look at them and inspect them and mistreat them. Well, that's the same thing you're doing, really virtually, when you're on the internet and you're not protected and you're not covered up and you don't have a raincoat over your fingertips so you don't get any on you. You don't want to get any of this stuff on you. But fortunately, ExpressVPN can prevent the 4 diseases of the apocalypse, the syphilis of the keyboard, the gonorrhea of the internet, the various STDs that you can get from getting on the internet unprotected, and all of it goes into your computer, and it'll drive your computer insane. The keyboard syphilis that's going around these days, eventually it's madness and death for your computer. You'll know, if you take your computer's temperature regularly, you'll know by that. That's an early warning sign. But if your computer starts jumping up and down and running around the room and kicking things and screaming, that's a good indication that you have keyboard syphilis. So anyway, the friends at ExpressVPN, they can cover you up on all this stuff. No more communicable diseases and no more people staring at your private dangly bits. Your internet service providers, they are looking at your dangly bits. They know every single website you visit. And they can sell this information to the ad companies and the big tech giants who's going to use that data to target you. Have you heard about this? They're targeting you. And now you may be walking down the street on the way home from a Cub Scout meeting, and you'll never see it coming. Suddenly, a giant crowbar swings out from behind a tree, and your brains are grape jelly.
What are you
They're targeting you.
What are you
They're
talking about?
You. They're watching you. They're following you. They're targeting you.
Who is?
I just said the big ad companies and the tech giants. They're using your data to target you. There may be snipers in the trees.
No.
You never know. You can't go outside because you're being targeted. But ExpressVPN is going to put a stop to it. They're going to create a secure encrypted tunnel between your device. I guess that's what we're calling it these days, your device. Well, you know, the equipment. Yeah, wink, wink, nod, nod. But this tunnel goes from your equipment to the internet so that your online activity can't be seen by anybody. Your equipment will go straight through this encrypted tunnel right into the internet to the porn that you're watching, and nobody's going to be able to see what you're watching. And you can use, what? Am I telling a lie?
Keep going. Keep going.
You can use ExpressVPN.
You okay over there?
You can use ExpressVPN on all your devices. As I said, that's what we're calling them now. It works on everything. Phones, laptops, routers, even
Diddlator Mach 3.
the Diddlator Mach 3. It works on that too. So that way people won't be, you know, you can find those where you can wire them up to the end. You can buzz them from remotely and send people a greeting. Anyway.
Raw dog.
The best part is using ExpressVPN is as easy as closing the bathroom door or picking your balls up off Main Street, putting them back in your pants and walking on. That's easy to do also, but ExpressVPN, you just fire up the app, you click one button and you are protected. No more communicable diseases that you will contract from the internet service providers knowing everything about you and what you're doing and targeting you for persecution and expulsion and expatriation.
Expulsion? Expatriation from what?
They're going to kick you out of the country. They're targeting you. They're on your back.
The advertisers?
All of them. They want rid of your ass.
Why would they want to get rid of?
Because you know too much.
All right.
But you want to know how to get...
Well, no one will accuse us of knowing too much, but we're talking about ExpressVPN.
Yes, we are. And if you want to know how to get this stuff, if you're like me, folks,
then we're sorry. We're very sorry.
If you're like me and believe your online activity is your business and nobody else's business and a business you need to keep to yourself at all costs, secure yourself by visiting expressvpn.com/JCE today. That's an exclusive link. expressvpn.com/JCE. You'll get an extra 3 months of this fine protection free. Don't let your dangly bits get cut and fall off and roll down into a storm drain. That's expressvpn.com/JCE, 3 months free, and peace of mind knowing that your device will be protected.